Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be analyzing some more candidates games, but before I get into the video, I'd really appreciate if you went and checked out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/stevis5 and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to look at the games from round 4 of the 2022 candidates tournament. So I'm going to start here with Richard Rapport versus Hikaru Nakamura. Quite an interesting pairing. Two players who at this point had 1.5 out of 3. So looking to maybe get a win, particularly Rapport with the white pieces. By the way, I didn't really talk about this in my previous recaps, but Rapport did recently decide to switch federations to Romania. Maybe I should change his flag in future recaps. I still have him under Hungary here. Anyway, that's something we can get into a little later. But this game went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and here bishop b5, which is standard Spanish. Rapport often tends to play some offbeat openings, so he actually hasn't played bishop b5 as much. In some faster time controls, he's actually played 3g3, which is a kind of interesting sideline. Anyway, in this game, we got bishop b5, knight f6, and d3. And Rapport's actually never played this before, but this is quite common theory, so it makes sense that he would have prepared it. And Nakamura was also probably expecting this because Caruana played this same anti-Berlin, this d3 move against him. So also Nakamura even has played this himself with white. I think he played it in round 2 against Radjabov. Sometimes Rapport in the past has played castles and gone for the quick draw line in the Berlin, of course, which I'll just go through pretty quickly. Anyway, this game we got d3, bishop c5, take, and castles. Here, if you remember, Caruana in this position played knight bd2 against Nakamura, and here Nakamura ended up going eventually for this h6 g5 idea. And in this game we got something pretty similar. So here Rapport chose castles instead of knight bd2. We had bishop d6, defending this pawn, bishop g5, and now once again we have this h6 g5 idea. So Nakamura is definitely favoring these types of setups in his Berlin games nowadays, it seems like. So Nakamura has definitely had a lot of games here. This is quite a standard position, and of course for the past few years, and really quite a while, Nakamura has been a regular Berlin player. Bishop e6 was the continuation in one of his games against Wesley So. But in this game he chose g5, and now bishop g3 and bishop e6. And this is a novelty. And some novelties, it's not clear why they're a novelty, or it's just a pretty theoretical opening, and you see a novelty far down the line, maybe on move 20 or 25 or something. But in this game, we get a novelty on move 9. And the reason is that this move just gives up a pawn for free. So it's just a somewhat strange move. Here, there was a Caruana So game that continued in a more logical way with queen e7, just defending the pawn. And another option is knight d7 to defend the pawn, but the problem is that this traps the bishop in on c8. So Nakamura wanted to get his bishop out first and then go knight d7. So you might be asking, of course, what happens if white just takes on e5? So if white takes with a knight, we get a lot of complications here after the move h5, threatening h4 to trap the bishop. And if white just plays the natural h3 to give the bishop a retreat square, now after rook g8, it's very complicated. And the computer even gives black an advantage, because they have a very strong attack, h4 and g4 are coming, and this looks very dangerous. And here, the top line for white is the move knight f3, and now bishop takes g3, f takes g3, because h takes g3 would be creating more hooks for black after h4. So f takes g3 is more natural, but now after g4, knight g5, there's queen d4 check, and black is winning back their pawn, and now this is one option. Maybe Nakamura had this in his prep. It's an incredibly complicated position with opposite sides castling and open lines for both sides. So this would have been very interesting. Now, white can also take the pawn on e5 with the bishop, but now take queen d4, and black immediately wins this pawn back. And this feels pretty good. White isn't really getting in their knight d2, rook b1 stuff as quickly here. So queen d2 was played in the game by Rapport, and his idea is now to play queen c3 and try to put some pressure. So Nakamura plays knight d7 to defend his pawn, and now d4 f6. So now Nakamura has sort of consolidated this pawn structure. And this might look a little weakening, but the fact that white doesn't have a light square bishop here is somewhat important to this strategy, because the light squares are all weak, but it's hard for white to take advantage of that. So here queen c3 was played. Rapport continues with his plan, and now we have e takes d4, knight takes d4, and queen e7, which leads to some trades here. We get takes on d6, and then trade on e6, and here Rapport plays the move queen b3. So this is all pretty much the engine's top line, and now Nakamura sort of has a choice. b7 is under attack, so Nakamura has to do something about that. He can either take on b3 or go knight c5. Now, after taking on b3, here black is probably still more or less fine, but the danger is that white has an open A file, so these doubled pawns actually kind of help white in the sense that they make the a1 rook very useful. And white still has this 4 versus 3 on the king side, which could come in handy. So instead, Nakamura decides to play knight c5, and now after take, rook d1 is played, king e7, and now knight d2. Nakamura said after the game that here he looked at knight a3, but knight d2 and knight a3 sort of have the same purpose, which is to bring the knight to c4. But now you can see that Nakamura sort of has a plan here, and there is also a reason why this knight c5 to e6 maneuver ended up being helpful, which is that now black plays the move g4, and this takes space and helps prevent white from playing the moves f3 and h3, particularly after black's next move. Or actually no, black doesn't play this idea right away, but the idea basically is knight g5 next, and now that completely shuts down white playing f3 or h3 so that their kingside pawns are frozen, and e4 is loose. So rook d2 here was played, and Nakamura said he looked at knight e3, and here there's some options. The knight g5 could be played, and now there's potential for a perpetual check, so that's one way that this game could have ended pretty quickly. But rook d2 was played, and now we get a series of trades, but Nakamura decides to still keep some pieces on the board, And now knight g5. And so once again, this e4 pawn is weak, and f3 and h3 are shut down. So this was a nice idea that Nakamura looked at in his preparation. And now knight a5 is played, and this creates some counter chances. Now, I should mention that I did say that the e4 pawn is hanging, so the natural move would be rook e2, but now black gets to take over the open file with rook d8, and you can see the issue with white not being able to play f3 or h3. Also, g3 would run into knight f3 and rook d1, and that would just lead to checkmate. So, knight a5 is played, seeking counterplay. And now b7 and c6 are somewhat loose. So here, Nakamura chooses to play the move h4. Now, c5 was also an option. And now after knight takes b7, rook b8, and knight c5, rook b2. But Nakamura said he was somewhat worried about h4 here. And after takes is kind of necessary because here rook b1, king h2, now you can see that white is quite safe. And rook d7 is coming, and white's also just up a pawn. So gh3 would be played, and now after f4, it's somewhat unclear. Knight e6 is still probably okay for black. There's also rook d7, rook c7, and we get all these trades. And this probably also just leads to a draw because it's even material. A lot of things are getting traded off. So c5 was another option, but h4 was played, just continuing to take space, and now rook d3. And here, knight takes b7 could have been played, but now rook b8 and rook b2 is the idea, and after knight c6, king f7. And the king is running out. You can see that rook b1 is a big threat, so white has to play a move like king f1, and now knight takes e4, and white essentially has some problems because if their rook starts to get active, the black rook also gets active. f2 is loose, which is another big issue. These pawns are very far up the board, so there's potential for black to create a lot of trouble here. So rook d3. Now c5 is played. Here, rook b8 is another option, but white essentially can do whatever they want now, and rook d3 sets up either f3 or h3. So let's say f3, and now white should be doing quite well. So that's why this move c5 is played. You don't really want to waste time trying to defend the b7 pawn. So c5, and here h3 is played. So if white takes on b7, now rook b8, take, and once again, the weak first rank is sort of the problem here. So h3, take. Here, the computer suggests rook b8, and king f1, let's say, and now king e6, and the black king steps out of b6, knight c6, so now b6 is coming, and then the black rook will find a better square other than b8. Plus, black can also try to activate the king with king e5. So that was an option, but b6 is a lot more natural, and now we get knight c6, king e6, knight a7, and rook a8 is played, knight b5, we get a bunch of pawns traded off. Here, probably the simplest way was to play king f7, and now if rook b3 is played, defending b2 and attacking b6, there's c4, rook b6, c3. And this idea forces a lot of trades, and now this is probably a draw, because essentially, I mean, black is down 2 pawns temporarily, but they're also attacking 3 pawns, and there's just not enough pieces on the board. This is very reduced material, so it should just be a pretty simple draw. Also, all of white's pawns are weak. So king e5 was played in the game. And now after knight d5, white has some chances. This knight puts pressure on the b6 and f6 pawns. And here, Nakamura said he miscalculated. One problem for black is that knight takes e4 runs into knight takes b6. Now you can't take b2 because of knight c4 check with the fork. And if rook a1 and let's say king f4, now knight c4 is going to be pretty strong for white. White's just up a pawn. So this is not really an issue. So you want to find an alternative. c4 makes sense. And here there are a lot of ways for white to slip up. For instance, f4 is actually a mistake because now king takes e4 and the rook is hanging. So after knight c3, king f4, and black is just winning. We can get this trade, but this is going to be a winning knight endgame for black due to their activity. And there are other options here. For instance, if rook d4 check, king g3, and now knight a2 runs into knight f3 with the handy fork. And in addition to that, if rook g4 here, there's king h3, and now the rook is going to hang. So if rook h4 takes, and this should be winning for black, and if rook g5, sort of using the idea of danger levels, trying to desperado the rook, now black saves their rook with rook a1 and they win. So essentially there are some tricky lines here. But after c4, rook e3, now if knight takes e4, knight takes b6, and let's say c3, trying to do something about this pawn, takes rook c2. Now white gets to play f3 and takes advantage of this pin, and they should probably be winning here. Still not so easy, but as long as they can preserve the h-pawn, they will win, and certainly they can't lose. So c4 would have been a mistake, so Nakamura tries rook a1. Now king g2 is played, and here knight e6. If king h2, then f2 would be hanging, so that's a pretty straightforward line. King g2, and now knight e6 is played. b6 can't be captured because of knight f4 check. And here, black, if white plays some random move, black can start trying to trade off pawns and simplify, and they should be completely fine. And if white tries rook b3, putting pressure on the b6 pawn, now black has knight d4, rook b6, f5, and they try to trade some stuff off. Now if knight e3, fe4, white already sort of has to force a draw because black has knight f3 and rook g1 ideas, so white has to be careful. So in the game, c4 was played, anchoring in the knight, and making white's pawn structure a little nicer. So rook e1, rook e3, but now it's a pretty straightforward draw because everything just gets traded off the board and all the pawns come off, and here the players agree to a draw. So a hard-fought game. Neither Nakamura nor Rapport make any progress in the standings, though. Now on to another game in this round between Duda and Radjabov. And this was another interesting game. I actually predicted Duda to win this game. Another game, well, actually, no. Radjabov, I think, had 1 out of 3. And Duda had 1.5. So Duda was definitely the one hoping to win this game to kickstart his chances to win this candidate. So he played e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, so another Berlin. In the last game we looked at, we had bishop takes c6 here, but Duda chose bishop g5. And this is quite an unusual move, which Duda has actually never played before. So a lot of his games have continued with either bishop takes c6 or c3, which is another pretty common move here. So bishop g5, already unusual territory. And here Duda plays knight c3. Another sort of strange move, because generally in these types of positions, white wants to go c3, possibly hoping for d4, and then put the knight on d2. So it's kind of strange to put the knight on c3. And here there are some games that have continued with the move c3. But knight c3 was played, and now bishop d7. Here there are some games after a6, trying to do something about this bishop, and pretty often this bishop ends up getting chased. Something like bishop a4, b5, bishop b3, knight a5 can happen. So bishop d7 was played though, and here Duda played a novelty, which is the move knight to a4. One game continued here, knight d5, and now after g5, black is actually quite a bit better here. This was a Titled Tuesday game, actually. And here black got pretty serious advantage, as you can see. f5, f4 is just coming pretty quickly. d5 is also hanging. So there are just a lot of issues here, and this bishop is terrible. So knight a4 was played in this game, though, and that's simply chasing the c5 bishop. So here bishop b4 check was played. And Radjabov is basically saying that he's going to provoke c3 b4. Basically, in this position, he could have played bishop b6, and then we would get something very similar, except this time around, white has c3 and b4 included. It's unclear who this favors. I would probably lean toward white. I would say that this expansion is pretty reasonable, but it also makes it harder for white to go d4 at some point. So castles is played, knight e7, and here white has a choice of what trade they want to make. They can take on d7, and now black will take with the knight to prevent bishop f6. And now white can play d4. This is a position kind of unclear, but it does feel like white should be doing pretty well. Or they can take on f6, and this is what Duda did in the game. So now black gets these doubled pawns. We get some more trades, and now knight h4. And basically Duda's saying that he's going to hope to prevent black from getting an f5. Because if he can do that, white should be better here. Black can't really castle kingside anymore, so they're going to have to castle queenside, but in that resulting opposite sides castling position, white can take on b6 and go a4, a5, and open things up pretty easily, and if black can't get an f5, they'll have no counterplay. So that's sort of the upcoming battle that's going to happen over the next few moves. Here, knight takes b6 and a4 was another option that's pretty natural, but probably Duda was worried about here f5. So knight h4 is played, and now we get rook g8, natural move, king h1, castles queenside, and now take, and queen f3. And here Duda is trying to prevent the move f5. So here a4 could be played, and Duda was probably worried about this f5 idea, and now if a5, there's fe4, and if a takes b6, now actually queen g4, and black is better, because white has no attack. The black king can find safety on d7 if necessary, and black is just trying to trade queens. So in the game, Duda played queen f3, and this looks like a very logical move, but Radjabov uncorked a nice idea here, which is the move f5. And it seemed like this was what Duda was trying to prevent this whole time. But as it turns out, f5 can still be played. So if knight f5, take, rook g5, now black is just completely fine. They're going to win the pawn, and then we're going to get an equal rook endgame. Here, if e takes f5, then rook g5, and white can hold on to their pawn temporarily with g4, but this takes a lot of risk, and now after h5, white's pawn structure is already falling apart. If h3, there are going to be huge problems. Now rook h4 is coming, and everything is falling apart for white. So that's just not an option. And in the game, Duda played e takes f5, but now once again after rook g5, you can't go g4, so this pawn's just going to be lost. So a4 is played. By the way, I guess I should also mention that if f6, there's knight f5 here, and the pawn is going to be lost anyway after take, f6 is just too weak. So that's another option. Rook g5, a4, and now take. And Duda decides to keep the queens on the board. He could have taken on f5, but this is just pretty much completely equal. So we get queen e3, rook d g8, rook g1, and now queen f4, take. So now we do get a rook endgame anyway, but it's a little more imbalanced. White has the open e file, so he puts a rook there, rook e5. Here maybe king d7 was a little better because it controls the rook's entry squares and prepares rook a8. But rook e5 is played, we get d4, and now g3, and the rest of the game is pretty even, pretty balanced. We get some trades. Here, Radjabov plays the move c5, forcing some more pawns off the board. If rook a3 here, there's rook f6, king e7, rook f3, and white holds the pawn, and now it's just a draw. And here we get some trades, and eventually the players do agree to a draw. So a pretty balanced game. Radjabov holds his own with black. And now on to the next one. We have Ding playing Caruana, which is quite an interesting pairing, because in the last candidates, in 2020 and 2021, Ding actually defeated Caruana with the white pieces in a key game pretty early on. I don't remember, it might have been, I think it was round 3, if I recall correctly. So Caruana hasn't had the best history against Ding, and that was definitely a storyline going into this game. Now, Caruana at this point had 2 out of 3, and Ding had 1 out of 3, so for that reason it was also very important for Ding to win this game to cement himself as someone who could have chances to win this tournament, basically. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5. We get a queen's gambit declined here. Pretty standard Rogozin. Caruana decides to play. So here Ding chooses queen a4, which he's only played twice. He often plays bishop g5, and he had some games here. But queen a4 is played, knight c6 forced, e3, castles, here queen c2. In Ding's only game from this position, he chose bishop d2. But he plays queen c2, and here Caruana uses a very interesting idea, which has only been played once in a game on Chess24 in the Banter Blitz Cup. So an online blitz game, obviously not a very important game, and probably Ding didn't look at this idea at all, I'm assuming. So, actually, I should say that Anish Giri was doing commentary during this game, and he mentioned that this was an idea that he had been shown by Vladimir Chuchilov, who's a known chess trainer who trained Geary and Caruana, and he's been working with Caruana very recently. So it would be logical that this is something that Caruana and Chuchilov worked on. So this is a very interesting position. By the way, I should say there are plenty of other moves here. For instance, rook e8 is pretty standard, and there have been plenty of games here. Caruana even played rook e8 pretty recently, last year, against Aronian. So he probably has been saving this idea. So c5 was played by Ding, very logical. He's saving his pawn by pushing it forward and taking space, sort of taking advantage of Black's awkward piece placement. Now b6 is played, trying to quickly break up White's pawns. And here White has two options. There's bishop d2 and there's a3. So after a3, take, Black goes knight e4, queen c2, and takes on c5. And here White should be doing pretty well, but only, at least according to the computer, only if they find the move b4, which is pretty counterintuitive, just a sort of strange looking move, not something you would expect to see in a game. So instead, Ding goes for a more natural approach, bishop d2, and here Caruana plays knight c4, which is a novelty. So in that one Chess24 game, b takes c5 was played here, and this is how the game continued, and eventually I think White won. But knight c4 is played, and this is putting pressure on d2, and now a3. So we get knight takes d2, and here White has an option. They can decide to take on d2, or they can take on b4. And queen takes d2 here runs into knight e4, and that's kind of annoying. So basically, those two captures are the only options. And after a takes b4, take, queen e7, this at first might look quite good for White because they sort of maintain this space on the queen side, and they have the open g file to use. But Caruana probably looked at this pretty deeply, which is maybe one of the reasons that Ding didn't want to go for this. And also Black will be able to create counterplay on the queen side eventually, and things often, or at least it seems like in a lot of the main lines here, or the top computer lines, things get very complicated. So knight takes d2 is what happened. And we got some trades, and now a5, rook c1, bishop a6, so Caruana is trying to trade, and we get this position. And at first this might look completely fine, probably even an opening success for Black, because they've traded a bunch of pieces, and, you know, they're a little worse. White has control over the open c file. There's this backwards b6 pawn, which could be an issue, but it doesn't seem like that much. But I would say that White actually has quite a significant advantage here, because Black has no counterplay, first of all. It's very tough to play these types of positions with Black because you know that your opponent is the only one who can win. White is always playing for two results here, and they can just slowly apply pressure both on the board and on the clock and hope that at some point you make a mistake. And there are ways, if you're not careful, to immediately go wrong. For instance, if you play like queen d7, now White can play queen c6, and if you trade queens, at this point White might already be winning, basically. And in these endgames, you have to be really careful, because if you make one inaccuracy, the position can go from drawn to White being winning. And it's not like White has some immediate win, but they're just going to slowly put pressure, and Black is just extremely passive here. So these endgames can be very dangerous, but Caruana has some ideas up his sleeve. So here rook a8 is played, and now queen b3, putting pressure on b6, and here Caruana plays rook c8. And I think this is one of the best moves I've seen played in the candidates so far. it looks like not necessarily a very impressive move. In fact, it just looks like it loses a pawn, and it does. But Caruana calculated out this line pretty deeply, and he realized that with some precise play, Black is going to be down a pawn, but they're going to be very active. Now Black has the open C file, and after A4, fixing White's pawn so they can't go B4, Queen B4, Queen C2, already it's a little hard for White to come up with anything here, because even though they're up a pawn, it's very hard to make progress. They could try Knight B1 to C3, for instance, but then Black can even just go Rook A8, and then how do you attack this pawn even more? It's very hard to untangle your pieces here. So Ding decides to go B3, forcing these pawns off the board. But now Knight E4, another active move. This ties down the rook to F2, and just puts this piece on a very active square. So Ding tries A4, and now we get Queen C4, getting these queens off the board. Now Black even has a passed pawn of their own. Knight C5 is played. Here the computer suggests an interesting move F3, and this could have led to some complications after take, Rook A8, Rook B1, and we get this Rook endgame where it's probably just a draw. Most 5 versus 4 same side Rook endgames are a draw, but it requires some precise defense. White can always try to create a passed pawn later on with D5, so it's not so easy. But here Knight C5 was played, and now we got trades, and now Rook A8. Here, White has some options on where to put his rook. If Rook C1, Rook A4, C6, it looks like White's pawn is just running. But Black's king is in time because C7, Rook A8, and now White can't take on C4 due to this back rank mate, and after H3, Rook C8, King E7, and this pawn's just going to be lost. So Ding tries Rook B1, and so King F8, because you want to be able to take on A4 and not blunder checkmate. So Rook B4 is played, C3, Rook C4, King E7, King F1, C2, and these pawns are traded off. And now we get this Rook endgame, where White has this extra passed pawn, but it shouldn't be enough for White to win, because the Black king is very active and very close to this pawn, so it should just end up being won. And Rook B8, Rook C7, now Rook H8, King E7 is played, Rook H7, G6, and this pawn will be lost no matter what. Now Black is pretty much in a position where they can easily draw this endgame. Rook N4 versus Rook N3 on the same side is pretty straightforward, and Caruana shows his class by going F5, just taking space and making sure that White won't be able to create a passed pawn, and the rest is pretty easy. Now actually this is, by the way, the same Rook endgame from Radjabov Firouzja in round 1. This Rook N2 versus Rook N1, but in that game it ended in a draw, and this was no different. The players eventually agreed on a draw. So another hard-fought game with chances for Ding, but Caruana holds on to his plus score. And now the final game we're going to look at, which was really interesting, was Nepomniachtchi versus Firouzja. And here we got a Sicilian, and a Najdorf was played, F3. This was actually played in the only other Sicilian game up to this point in the tournament, which I think was between Caruana and Duda. And here Nepo's played some other moves. He even had some games with Rook G1, which is sort of a sharp line, B5, G4, some crazy games here. But this game was a little more tame, more common line here. And if you remember in the Caruana-Duda game, Duda played this move H5. to prevent g4, and Duda ended up getting a pretty comfortable position and drawing with ease. Instead, Firouzja chose bishop e7, we got queen d2, castles, castles. Firouzja's never played this before. In a previous game, Firouzja has never faced this before, I should say, with the black pieces. There was a previous game where Firouzja faced knight d5, but we got castles queenside, knight bd7, g4, b5, g5, b4. So both sides are instantly going for these attacking ideas on opposite sides of the board, which is why this move h5 could have been played earlier on to sort of prevent white's attacking ideas with g4, g5. So now things are getting very sharp, and we get f4, a5, f5. Here the main move, which has been played in countless games, is the move a4. Plus 4? I don't know what that's in reference to. Someone said that in the chat. Okay. Here a4 is normally played, and we get a series of trades, and this is a line that's happened many times. It usually ends in a draw, but it's very complicated. I think there's a lot of forcing moves here, and yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to look at in terms of top-level theory in this line. But in this game, Firouzja chose this move bishop c4. And this is a very interesting idea, and I suspect that Firouzja and his trainers spent a lot of time looking at this. As it turns out, this move has been played quite a few times, but mostly in correspondence games, which is actually a very good resource to look at, because in correspondence games, players have usually a few days to make each move, which means they can come up with some very cool and innovative opening ideas, as opposed to normal, even classical games. Usually the players are blitzing out the opening pretty quickly and spending a few minutes at most on every move. So this bishop c4 idea has been played. It's even also been played in some computer games, which is interesting as well. So here king b1 was played by Nepomniachtchi. The main move is knight g3, because essentially this bishop's eyeing a2, and black is going to play a4 next, and then this pawn's just hanging. But now white gets the bishops off the board, and after a4 plays knight a1. And this might look very counterintuitive, but it turns out to give white an advantage according to the engine. But in the game, Nepo played king b1, which is more natural to meet a4 with knight c1. And here Firouzja plays the move d5, another idea that's been played many times in correspondence games. So Firouzja clearly did his homework, and here e takes d5 was played in a lot of games. I even actually found a Danny Wrench game here, which is funny because I did watch him do commentary on this game, and I don't think he mentioned that. So, you know, it is funny that even commentators in these types of events have played into these opening lines. You never know what you will find when you look at the database. Anyway, so e takes d5 can be played. Nepo chose f6 with the idea of knight g3 to f5 coming, and g takes f6. Here knight g3 is the main move, but Nepo instead played g takes f6, which is novelty, a new move actually. But now he went for the same knight g3 idea, with the knight quickly coming to f5. And here bishop takes f1 was played, which is actually slightly inaccurate, and black should try to keep the tension here. The computer suggests either queen c7 or knight d6. Knight d6 has an idea of even playing knight b5 to c3 here, or knight b5, a3, and then knight c3 more likely. And queen c7 is just sort of maintaining the tension, and if white decides to go for this, trying to trap black's rook, because if black plays knight g7, then queen g5 comes, or actually probably more simply takes, and then knight f5 or queen g5 and knight f5. There are a lot of issues here, so black will have to give up the exchange, but black is actually still just better here, because now c3 is coming and these pawns are very menacing. But bishop takes f1 is played, and the difference here is that now we get a3, b3, and now if a move like knight d6 is played, let's say, with this same idea, white can, for instance, go bishop h6, king h8, take, but here, even if black gets in knight b5 to c3, white can move their king away. Also, this d5 pawn is hanging, and black doesn't really have much of an attack here in exchange for the exchange that they're down, if that makes sense. They don't have enough compensation, basically. So king h8 is played to meet bishop h6, possibly with rook g8. E takes d5, and here knight d6. And this is a critical mistake. Firouzja probably should have played queen c7, trying to maybe pile up on the c file, put more pressure there. Here, the computer suggests an interesting idea, which is rook f6. And now the d pawn runs, and we could get a lot of complications after a line like queen d7, bishop c5. Now white's trying to scoop up these pawns. But now black can play bishop g7 and f5, apparently. So that could have led to a crazy position. But instead, Firouzja plays knight d6, and now Nepo just takes on b4. And this is just a free pawn. So rook c8, Firouzja tries, but now bishop b6. And here, the queen is lined up with the bishop, and Nepo finds by far the best move, just bringing the queen to safety. It's not the easiest move to see, but it's queen e1. You bring the queen all the way back. Now the queen is very safe. e5 is loose. White is just simply up a pawn. Their king's perfectly safe. And white's just winning here. In 26 moves, Nepo is just completely winning. And now it's just a matter of technique. d6 is played, further restricting black's bishop. And now Nepo brings his pieces into the game. He forces a trade here. Now he's getting his rook in. After f6, the rook can always swing to h4, now that the bishop isn't covering that anymore. We get queen e2, hitting the knight. Knight b2 is played. Now just rook f1, saving the rook. Rook e8, rook h4. And Nepo's bringing all of his pieces to line up against the black king. Firouzja tries f5, threatening the rook, and now Nepo finds the final crushing blow against the black king. This is where, if I was a God Mator, I would tell you to pause the video and try to look for it, but I literally have the engine lines right there, so that's probably not worth it. Rook h7 was played, and now queen h5, knight f5 comes in, bishop f6, and rook g1, and here Firouzja resigned to spare himself the forced checkmate that would occur after king f8, queen h6, king f7, rook g7, and now if takes, there's checkmate, and if king f8, there's queen h8, queen g8 takes, and that's also mate. So a crushing win for Nepomniachtchi, who gets to 3 out of 4. Okay, well, that's it, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye.